The front door swung open with a hollow creak, and the search party hesitated on the threshold. Inside, the Bender cabin was deathly still. The midday sun barely pierced the grime-streaked windows, casting a thin, sickly light over the abandoned room. A pot of stew sat cold on the stove. 4 plates, each half filled with food, were left scattered across the table, as if the family had risen in the middle of their meal and simply disappeared. Chairs were overturned. A man's coat hung loosely from a peg by the door, swaying slightly in the draft. The air smelled of damp earth, sour meat, and something else, something worse, just faint enough to catch if you breathed too deep. Boots thudded softly across the wood floor. The men called out, but no one answered. The Benders were gone. And for a brief, uneasy moment, some of the searchers wondered, had the family fallen victim too? Had the evil that stalked this trail finally found them as well? They pressed deeper into the house, past the silent hearth, past the empty beds, past the still staring eyes of a cracked porcelain doll forgotten on a shelf. No sign of life anywhere, except for the distant rustle of prairie grass just outside. Certain that no one was home, some of the search party stepped back out and turned their attention toward the nearby orchard and trail. Little did they know, the truth had been right there inside with them the entire time. In 1870, a few years before the cabin stood empty, the Bender family arrived on the prairie in Labette County, Kansas, looking for a new life. John Bender Sr. was a large, heavy-set man with a thick German accent and a permanent scowl that seemed carved into his face. His wife Elvira was even colder. Locals called her Ma Bender, though few said it kindly. She barely spoke to anyone, and when she did, her voice came out low and sharp, like a hiss. Their son, John Jr., was lanky and awkward, smiling too much and laughing at odd times, as if hearing jokes that no one else could. Travelers who stopped at the inn remembered the long ride in. The cabin usually came into view just as the sun started to dip behind the grasslands, the lantern light inside glowing faintly through the windows. A dog might bark in the distance, or smoke drifted from the chimney. To a weary settler or a lost rider, the place looked like salvation. It offered warmth, food, and a roof, something most people couldn't afford to pass up. The frontier was dangerous, and a hot meal behind 4 solid walls was more than most could hope for. But as months passed, unease began to settle over the area. People traveling the Osage Trail started to disappear along the way. A man heading west to find land for his family, a young woman chasing the promise of a new start, a merchant carrying goods to sell in the next town over, all gone, and all had one thing in common. They had all paid a visit to the Bender Inn. The trail itself was dangerous, and everyone knew it. Between wild animals, brutal weather, and the threat of outlaws, there were plenty of ways a traveler could vanish without warning. Sometimes wagons were found abandoned along the roadside, horses roaming without their riders. In some cases, personal belongings turned up in nearby towns, but their owners were never seen again. As the months dragged on, the stories that followed the trail began to grow darker. People said the stretch near the Bender Inn had a strange feeling about it. Some who passed through remembered feeling watched. Others mentioned how something just felt off, though they couldn't quite explain why. It felt almost as though something or someone haunted the area. Most travelers who passed through Labette County didn't expect much when they stopped for the night. A warm place to sleep was a luxury. A hot meal was rare. The Bender Inn offered both. By the time the trail dipped low enough for the cabin to appear on the horizon, most visitors had been riding for hours through wind, heat, and dust. The inn was a simple wooden structure, its lantern light flickering in the windows by sundown. A hand-painted sign out front advertised dry goods, coffee, and meals. Guests who arrived were usually met by John Jr., who greeted them with a wide smile and a laugh that often came at the wrong moments. He'd lead them into the front room, where the smells of cooking drifted in from the hearth, and shelves lined the walls with canned vegetables, flour, and small household items. Kate often emerged from the back room not long after, dressed well, friendly, curious about where travelers came from and where they were headed. She would sometimes offer to read palms or share visions, her voice soft and steady as she described connections to loved ones long gone. Elvira didn't usually say much. She kept to the stove, glancing at guests from beneath her brow, offering plates of stew or bread without smiling. John Sr. stayed mostly silent, sitting off to the side or outside by the porch, chewing tobacco and staring out into the grass. The main room was always warm, with a long table in the center where travelers would be seated. They were always offered the same spot, the chair with its back to the canvas divider that separated the room from the family's private quarters. At the time, no one thought anything of it. The food was plain but filling. The bedrolls were clean enough. The wind outside howled through the boards at night, but inside, the fire crackled and the oil lamps glowed. Most guests didn't stay long. They'd wake early, pack their things, and head out again by dawn. A few travelers who passed through and later spoke of it remembered small things, moments that felt off, though they couldn't quite explain why. One man said the house felt too still at night. Not just quiet, but silent, in a way that didn't feel natural, like even the wind was holding its breath. Another recalled feeling lightheaded after dinner, but not in the way hunger or heat usually hit him, more like something was pressing in around him, a heaviness he couldn't shake. Some chalked it up to long travel days and the strange energy Kate brought with her, always talking about the spirit world and forces most people didn't understand. At the time, none of it seemed worth remembering. Just oddities. Stories you tell later when the memory doesn't sit right. But years afterward, those small details started to sound different. Kate Bender was the most outgoing member of the family, and for many, the most intriguing. While her parents kept to themselves and her brother hovered in awkward silence, Kate welcomed guests with a smile and conversation. She advertised herself as a spiritual medium, someone who could heal illnesses, predict the future, and speak to the dead. In an era when the frontier was filled with grief, loss, and unanswered questions, that promise carried weight. Flyers circulated through the nearby towns with her name on them. Kate Bender, healer and seer. She held public demonstrations where she delivered messages from beyond, and private sessions where she told widows their husbands were watching over them, or assured settlers that their missing children were at peace. Some believed her completely. Others thought she was just clever and charismatic. Either way, people came. Travelers sought her out. Women with sick children, men mourning wives they'd buried in shallow prairie graves. Some came just for curiosity's sake, looking to see if she really had a gift. Her voice was calm and confident. She would close her eyes, take a breath, and speak slowly, sometimes staring just past a person as if seeing something behind them. Her presence made some people feel safe. Others said they felt unsettled, like the room got colder when she started speaking. There were rumors, too, that Kate talked to spirits even when no one else was around, that people staying at the inn heard her whispering behind the canvas wall late at night. One man claimed she told him things he had never said aloud, not to anyone. Another said she reached for his hand during a session, only to freeze mid-sentence, her face going pale before she stood up and left the room without explanation. Whether it was real or not didn't seem to matter. Her reputation grew, and the Bender Inn, tucked out there in the middle of the Kansas prairie, became something more than a stop on the trail. It became a place people sought out, not just for supplies or sleep, but for answers or closure. But over time, the stretch of trail near the Bender property started to gain a reputation. Travelers still passed through, but they talked about it differently, like something out there had changed, and not for the better. It took time, but people started to notice how many travelers weren't making it to the next town. One case in particular stood out. A settler named Henry Mackenzie had passed through the area with plans to buy livestock in Independence. He had a full wagon, enough cash for the purchase, and was expected to return within the week. Instead, his wagon was later found abandoned near a ravine, the horses missing, his supplies untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of him at all. Families back east were writing letters that went unanswered. A man's brother showed up in town asking questions. A merchant's horse was found loose, still wearing his saddle, grazing near the trail. It was hard to know what to do. There was no sheriff in Labette County, just farmers and settlers trying to survive. When someone vanished, it was easier to blame the trail. But everything began to shift when Dr. William York disappeared, a man known not just for his medical work, but for being deeply respected and trusted across the region. He was a well-known man, a physician and Civil War veteran traveling through the area to visit family. He had stopped along the trail to check in with patients, possibly even to visit a few families he had treated before. It was supposed to be a short trip, but after days passed with no word, people grew nervous. His horse was eventually found wandering near the trail. The saddlebag still held his medical supplies. That was enough to raise alarm. Unlike the others who had gone missing, Dr. York had family with power. One of his brothers was a state senator. The other had been a Union officer. They both came to Labette County and started asking hard questions, first to neighbors, then to the people running inns and roadside stores. And for the first time, people started comparing what they'd seen and heard. A few recalled hearing York had passed through the area. One man said he remembered seeing him on horseback, heading west near the Bender property. Another claimed York might have stopped for supplies. But no one had proof. It was all secondhand. Just vague accounts and fading memories. Still, a pattern was forming. The trail between Independence and Osage Mission was getting a reputation, not for weather or bandits, but for something haunting that people couldn't quite name. A few travelers who had passed through the Bender Inn mentioned strange feelings they couldn't quite put into words. One said the air felt heavier there. Another couldn't sleep the night he stayed, like something in the walls was awake. People just started keeping their distance, fearing what they might find if they went looking for answers. The York family didn't wait. Within days of William's horse being found, his brothers began organizing search parties. They moved quietly at first, visiting farms and homesteads along the trail, asking questions no one had dared to voice before. One by one, stories began to surface. A man who remembered seeing Dr. York ride toward a grove near the Bender property. A woman who thought she heard shouting the night he vanished. Another who recalled a bitter, rotting smell drifting over the grass for days after. Most of it was vague, fragments, rumors, but it was enough to turn suspicion into action. The York brothers returned with volunteers, nearly 50 men in total, determined to walk the trail from Independence to Osage Mission and check every property along the way. One by one, they searched the roadside stops. Most were cleared quickly. The land was wide open, the homes small and easy to read, until they reached the Bender Inn. That stop was different. Something about it felt off. The dog was gone, the garden overgrown, and though the lights inside were still burning, the place was empty. Not just empty, abandoned, as if the family had left in the middle of their lives. A pot of stew still sat on the stove. A coat still hung on the peg. Boots were left by the door. And then they found something. At first, no one knew what they were looking at. It was buried beneath a rug in the main room. Just a faint outline, a soft give under the wood. They cleared it slowly, pulling away the edges until they saw it. A trapdoor, hastily reinforced, sealed shut. When they pried it open, the air changed, heavy, sharp, and underneath, something that made even the strongest men stop moving. Some refused to go further, others stood silent. What they'd uncovered would not only explain the disappearances, it would uncover something far worse. Something that had been happening quietly, right under their feet. The table was always set before the guest arrived, with a pot of stew warming on the hearth, a few slices of bread on a plate, and a chair pulled out just slightly from the table. That chair always faced away from the back room, closest to the canvas divider that split the cabin in two. Guests almost always sat there without thinking. John Jr. would offer them a drink. Kate would sit across from them, smile, and ask where they were headed. Sometimes she'd offer to read their palm, or ask if they wanted to speak to someone they had lost. Most agreed. If a guest seemed poor, they were left alone. If someone was cautious or suspicious, they were politely sent on their way. But if someone appeared vulnerable, distracted, or alone, and they had something worth taking, then they were kept. And they never left. Kate didn't rely on tricks or illusions. There were no floating candles or sleight of hand. She used careful observation, instinct, and patience. She listened. She watched. She read the room the same way she read a palm. She would guess names, bring up the war, or mention little details, sometimes ones that felt too specific to be coincidence. Her voice was soft and calm, not like a performance, but more like comfort. Guests would lean forward, drawn in by her presence, often reacting emotionally. They never looked to see what was behind them. What they didn't realize was that someone was always standing just behind the curtain, John Sr., John Jr., or sometimes even Elvira, holding a hammer and watching. The curtain was thin enough to show slight movement through it. They waited for the right moment, when the guest looked down, closed their eyes, or took a drink. Some guests were given liquor, others a warm drink meant to help them relax. Some may have been dosed with something stronger, tonics or medicines common at the time, just enough to make them tired. Then came the sound of a heavy crack, the hammer striking the guest's skull. The victim would slump forward. If the blow hadn't killed them, Elvira would step forward and slit their throat while they were still unconscious at the table. The rug beneath the chair caught most of the blood, though the floor eventually became permanently stained. The body would be dragged to the trap door, opened, and lowered into the crawl space. That part was always quick. The rest came later, after dark, when they carried the body outside, past the garden and orchard, and buried it in a shallow grave. When time allowed, they stripped the bodies first, taking coins, clothes, or anything of value. Then they cleaned the room, replaced the rug, and reset the chair. By morning, everything was ready again. When investigators arrived, the scene told them everything they needed to know. The blood beneath a single chair, the splatter patterns they found, the trap door just steps away, the curtain thin enough to see movement behind it. It all confirmed what had taken place. No one had to confess. The layout of the room explained it. Months later, one traveler came forward. He said he'd sat in that exact chair with Kate across from him asking about his family, but something felt wrong. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind the curtain, watching him. He left before dinner was served. That decision may have saved his life. Word spread fast. Within days of the discovery, newspapers across Kansas and neighboring states were printing headlines about the House of Horrors found on the prairie. Reporters traveled to the site. Locals stood behind fences, too afraid or ashamed to step closer. What had once been a quiet roadside stop was now the center of a national nightmare. People from nearby towns came in wagons just to stare at the cabin. They didn't speak when they looked inside. They didn't touch anything. Some just stood in the doorway, hands in their pockets, staring at the spot where the chair had been. No one could understand how it had gone on for so long. The idea that an entire family had taken part, that they had eaten with people, prayed with them, and then killed them, was almost too much to believe. The governor posted a reward, but it didn't help. The Benders had vanished without a trace. Some believed they were dead. Others thought they'd escaped west and started over under different names. Every few years, someone claimed to have seen Kate, or John Jr., or even Elvira, but none of the leads ever held. Lawmen chased rumors all the way to Canada and Mexico, but they always came back empty-handed. Families who had lost someone traveled to the property, hoping for answers. Some brought letters or photographs. Some just stood by the edge of the orchard and cried. Most of the bodies were too damaged or decomposed to identify. Graves were marked with numbers. Names were guessed, but not confirmed. The inn was eventually torn down. The land was cleared, but the story never went away. Parents told it to warn their children, and travelers avoided the area for years. Even long after the site had disappeared into the grass, people said the prairie didn't feel the same there. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way.